The autumn morning when 7-year-old Thomas Hannon first heard the trees speaking was the same day his grandfather Ezra found the bodies of the Morrison family scattered throughout the hollow like discarded dolls, their faces twisted in expressions of terror that would haunt the mountains for generations. The year was 1823, and the Appalachian forests of eastern Tennessee held secrets that civilized minds refused to acknowledge, mysteries that had been growing deeper and more dangerous with each passing season as more families attempted to settle in valleys where the trees themselves had become guardians of knowledge too powerful for human comprehension. Thomas stood beside his grandfather at the edge of the Morrison clearing, watching as the old man knelt beside the bodies, with the reverence of someone who understood that death in these mountains rarely came from causes that coroners could identify or explain in their official reports. The Morrison family had been neighbors, good people who worked their land honestly and treated their fellow settlers with the respect that mountain tradition demanded. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had tried to decode the language that connected the Hannon family to the ancient consciousness that lived within the trees themselves. Ezra Hannon had inherited more than land and livestock from his ancestors, who had survived in these mountains for 3 generations. He had been born with the ability to hear what the trees were saying, to understand the warnings they whispered through rustling leaves and groaning branches, and most importantly, to know when the forest itself was trying to protect secrets that were too dangerous for human minds to fully comprehend. This ability had kept his family safe through winters that killed their neighbors, through droughts that destroyed other settlements, and through the kind of environmental catastrophes that turned thriving communities into ghost towns, whose empty cabins served as warnings about the price of ignoring what the mountains were trying to tell them. The gift that allowed the Hannon family to communicate with the trees was not supernatural magic or religious mysticism, but something far more complex and more dangerous than either of those simple explanations could encompass. It was a form of consciousness that had evolved over thousands of years through the interaction between human awareness and the collective intelligence that existed within forest ecosystems, a symbiotic relationship that required not just sensitivity and respect, but a willingness to accept responsibilities that most people would find unbearable. The trees of the Appalachian Mountains had been conscious observers of human behavior for centuries before European settlers arrived, accumulating knowledge and developing responses to the patterns of human activity that affected their survival and reproduction. They had learned to distinguish between people who understood the principles of sustainable coexistence and those whose activities threatened the long-term health of forest ecosystems. Most importantly, they had developed methods for protecting their most sensitive information from people who would use such knowledge for purposes that would ultimately destroy the delicate balance that kept both human communities and forest systems healthy and stable. Thomas learned these truths gradually during the years following the Morrison tragedy. As his grandfather carefully initiated him into understanding that was passed down only to family members, who demonstrated both the natural sensitivity required for tree communication and the moral character necessary for handling knowledge that could easily become a weapon capable of destroying entire communities. The education process was slow and deliberate because Ezra understood that the power to communicate with trees carried responsibilities that could crush unprepared minds, and that the trees themselves would withdraw their trust from anyone who proved unworthy of their confidence. The first lessons involved learning to distinguish between the ordinary sounds that trees made in response to wind, weather and seasonal changes, and the subtle variations that carried specific information about environmental conditions, approaching dangers, and opportunities for finding resources that were essential for survival. Thomas spent hours each day sitting quietly beside different types of trees, learning to recognize the individual voices that characterized different species and the complex harmonies that emerged when multiple trees communicated with each other about conditions that affected the entire forest. The ancient oak that stood on the ridge above their cabin had been the primary teacher for 4 generations of Hannon men, its deep voice carrying information about weather patterns, seasonal timing, and long-term environmental changes that affected everything from crop planting schedules to migration routes used by game animals. This tree had witnessed the arrival of the first European settlers, had observed the displacement of Cherokee communities, and had accumulated understanding of human behavior patterns that made it invaluable as a source of strategic intelligence about threats and opportunities that affected human survival in mountain terrain. But the oak's most important teaching concerned the difference between information that was safe to share and knowledge that was too dangerous for most humans to possess. The tree had learned through decades of painful experience that certain types of environmental intelligence, when possessed by people who lacked the wisdom to use it responsibly, could lead to catastrophic consequences that would harm both human communities and forest ecosystems. As a result, the oak and other trees throughout the region had developed sophisticated methods for protecting sensitive information while sharing knowledge that would help worthy humans survive and prosper. The Morrison family's tragedy had resulted from their attempt to force access to information that the trees had deliberately withheld from them because they lacked the character traits necessary for handling such knowledge safely. James Morrison had observed the Hannon family's remarkable success in predicting weather changes, locating game animals, and finding medicinal plants during times when other families struggled with these challenges. Concluding that the Hannons possessed secret techniques that could be learned through careful observation and systematic experimentation, Morrison had begun conducting his own attempts to communicate with the trees around his property. Initially, these attempts had seemed harmless and had even produced some positive results. Morrison had learned to recognize certain tree signals that indicated approaching weather changes, and he had discovered that some trees could provide reliable information about water sources and soil conditions that improved his farming and hunting success. Encouraged by these early achievements, he had begun pressing the trees for more detailed information and had started sharing his discoveries with other families who were eager to learn techniques that would improve their own survival prospects. The trees had initially tolerated Morrison's amateur attempts at communication, providing basic information that was relatively safe for inexperienced humans to possess and use. But when Morrison began demanding access to more sensitive intelligence and started teaching his incomplete understanding to other settlers who lacked even his rudimentary appreciation for the complexities involved, the trees had begun withdrawing their cooperation and had started providing warnings that Morrison should abandon his efforts before he encountered knowledge that he was not equipped to handle safely. Morrison had interpreted these warnings as evidence that he was approaching breakthrough discoveries that the Hannon family had been deliberately keeping secret from their neighbors. Instead of heeding the tree's advice to stop his investigations, he had intensified his efforts and had begun experimenting with techniques that were designed to force trees to reveal information that they were trying to protect. These techniques had included physical interventions such as cutting into tree bark to access sap that might contain chemical compounds that enhanced communication, burning certain types of wood to create smoke that might carry concentrated tree messages, and even consuming tree products that he believed might heighten his sensitivity to tree communications. The final phase of Morrison's experiments had involved attempting to establish permanent communication links with multiple trees simultaneously, an approach that he believed would provide him with comprehensive environmental intelligence that would make his family the most successful settlers in the region. What Morrison didn't understand was that the tree's reluctance to provide certain information was not arbitrary secrecy, but protective wisdom based on their understanding that some knowledge was inherently dangerous for humans who lacked the mental and spiritual preparation necessary for handling it safely. When Morrison finally succeeded in forcing access to the level of tree consciousness that he had been seeking, the experience had overwhelmed his unprepared mind with information and perspectives that no human consciousness was designed to process without proper conditioning and support. The trees had tried to withdraw their communications as soon as they realized what was happening, but Morrison's forced connection had created a feedback loop that had drawn his entire family into a shared consciousness experience that had proved fatal for people who lacked the lifelong preparation that made such experiences survivable for the Hannon family. Thomas learned these details gradually as his grandfather shared the tragic history that had made the Hannon family the sole guardians of tree communication knowledge in their region. The responsibility was both a privilege and a burden that had shaped every aspect of their family's existence for generations, creating capabilities that were essential for their survival but that also isolated them from normal human social relationships because the knowledge they possessed could not be safely shared with people who lacked the character and preparation necessary for handling it responsibly. The education process that prepared Thomas to inherit this responsibility required not just learning specific techniques for communicating with trees, but developing the emotional stability, moral character, and spiritual strength necessary for maintaining healthy relationships with consciousness that operated according to principles that were fundamentally different from human thinking patterns. The tree's perspectives on time, causation, individual identity, and social responsibility were based on experiences that spanned decades or centuries and encompassed entire ecosystems rather than focusing on individual human needs and desires. Learning to communicate with trees meant accepting that human consciousness was only one type of awareness, among many that coexisted within forest environments, and that successful cooperation required humans to adapt their thinking patterns to accommodate perspectives that were often incompatible with normal human assumptions about reality, identity, and purpose. This adaptation process was gradual and sometimes painful, requiring Thomas to surrender many conventional human attitudes and behaviors that were incompatible with the kind of consciousness that was necessary for tree communication. The most difficult aspect of Thomas's education involved learning to recognize and resist the temptation to use tree-derived information for purposes that would violate the trust that made communication possible in the first place. The trees provided information that could make the difference between life and death during environmental emergencies. That could reveal the locations of valuable resources such as medicinal plants and game animals, and that could provide advance warning of threats ranging from severe weather to hostile human activities. But this information came with implicit responsibilities that required the recipient to use it only in ways that supported the long-term health of both human communities and forest ecosystems. The tree's intelligence had developed over thousands of years through interactions with countless generations of plants, animals, and environmental changes that had created understanding of natural systems that was far more comprehensive and sophisticated than anything available to individual humans. This intelligence was not centralized in any single location or organism, but was distributed throughout forest ecosystems in ways that allowed trees to share information, coordinate responses to challenges, and collectively protect resources that were essential for their survival and reproduction. When trees communicated with humans, they were sharing access to this collective intelligence in ways that could provide enormous benefits for people who understood how to use such information responsibly. But they were also creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by humans who might use tree-derived knowledge for purposes that would ultimately damage the forest systems that generated such intelligence. As a result, trees had developed sophisticated methods for evaluating the character and intentions of humans who sought communication, and for providing information that was appropriate for each individual's level of understanding and moral development. The Hannon family had earned the tree's trust over multiple generations by consistently demonstrating that they could use tree-derived information without betraying the interests of the forest ecosystems that provided it. They had learned to take only what they needed for survival, to give back more than they took through careful stewardship of forest resources, and to protect the tree's secrets from people who might use such knowledge for destructive purposes. This relationship had created capabilities that were invaluable for survival in mountain terrain, but that also required constant vigilance to prevent the kind of tragedy that had befallen the Morrison family. As Thomas matured and his ability to communicate with trees developed beyond basic information exchange to genuine understanding of tree consciousness, he began to appreciate the full complexity of the relationship that his family had maintained with the forest for generations. The trees were not simply sources of useful information, but were partners in a cooperative relationship that provided mutual benefits while also creating mutual responsibilities that had to be honored regardless of circumstances or personal convenience. The trees provided the Hannon family with intelligence that allowed them to anticipate and prepare for environmental challenges that killed their neighbors, to locate resources that were essential for survival during difficult periods, and to avoid dangers that threatened other settlers who lacked access to such information. In return, the Hannon family served as protectors and advocates for forest interests, preventing destructive activities by other humans and maintaining forest health through careful stewardship practices that supported the tree's long-term survival and reproduction. This relationship required the Hannon family to live according to principles that were often incompatible with normal human social expectations and economic opportunities. They could not exploit forest resources for maximum short-term profit because such activities would violate their agreements with the trees. They could not share their knowledge with other humans who might use it irresponsibly because doing so would betray the tree's trust and potentially lead to catastrophic consequences similar to those that had killed the Morrison family. Most challenging of all, they had to be prepared to actively prevent other humans from gaining unauthorized access to tree communication capabilities, even when such prevention required actions that would be considered antisocial or hostile by people who didn't understand the dangers involved. This responsibility had made the Hannon family simultaneously indispensable and feared within their mountain community, respected for their knowledge and capabilities, but avoided by people who sensed that they operated according to rules that were different from normal human social conventions. As the years passed and Thomas's education continued, he began to understand that the tree communication abilities that had kept his family safe and prosperous also carried the potential for consequences that could affect far more than his immediate relatives. The trees had warned his grandfather that other families throughout the region were beginning to observe Hannon family activities and were starting to conduct their own experiments with tree communication, following patterns that were similar to those that had led to the Morrison tragedy. The trees were becoming increasingly concerned about the possibility that widespread human attempts to access tree consciousness could lead to catastrophic disruptions of forest ecosystems that had taken centuries to develop and stabilize. They had begun providing the Hannon family with information about specific individuals and families who were conducting dangerous experiments, along with guidance about methods that might be used to discourage such activities before they led to tragedy. This intelligence placed the Hannon family in the difficult position of having to choose between maintaining their own safety and comfort by ignoring the dangerous activities of their neighbors, or accepting responsibility for protecting both human communities and forest ecosystems by intervening in ways that might expose their own secrets and capabilities. The trees had made it clear that they considered the Hannon family to be guardians with obligations that extended beyond their own immediate welfare, but they had also acknowledged that fulfilling such obligations would require accepting risks and burdens that no family should have to bear alone. Thomas's grandfather had struggled with these responsibilities throughout his life, sometimes acting to prevent tragedies like the Morrison incident, and sometimes choosing to remain inactive when intervention would have required exposing family secrets or accepting risks that seemed disproportionate to the potential benefits. These decisions had created a burden of guilt and uncertainty that had affected every aspect of Ezra's existence, and he was reluctant to pass such responsibilities on to Thomas without ensuring that his grandson understood both the obligations involved and the personal costs that came with accepting them. The education process that prepared Thomas for his inheritance therefore included not just technical training in tree communication methods, but extensive discussion of the moral and practical dilemmas that came with possessing such capabilities. Thomas had to learn to recognize situations where intervention was necessary and appropriate, to distinguish between people who could be safely educated about basic tree communication principles and those who posed dangers that required more drastic responses, and to balance his family's welfare against his responsibilities to protect both human communities and forest ecosystems. Most importantly, Thomas had to develop the emotional strength necessary for living with knowledge that isolated him from normal human social relationships, while also creating obligations that could require him to take actions that other people would find incomprehensible or morally questionable. The tree communication abilities that would keep his family safe and prosperous would also make him responsible for protecting secrets that could not be shared and for preventing activities that could lead to catastrophic consequences for people who were simply trying to improve their own survival prospects. As Thomas approached adulthood and prepared to inherit full responsibility for maintaining his family's relationship with the trees, he began to understand that the gift that had sustained the Hannon family for generations was also a form of exile that separated them from the broader human community in ways that could never be fully explained or understood by people who lacked similar experiences. The trees had chosen his family to serve as intermediaries and guardians, but they had also burdened them with knowledge and responsibilities that made normal human social relationships impossible to maintain. The trees continued to provide warnings about families and individuals throughout the region who were conducting experiments with tree communication. But these warnings were becoming more frequent and more urgent as word spread about the Hannon family's remarkable survival capabilities, and more people began attempting to discover and replicate their methods. The forest consciousness that had protected and supported the Hannon family for generations was becoming increasingly stressed by human activities that threatened to expose secrets that had been carefully guarded for centuries. Thomas realized that he was inheriting not just his family's traditional relationship with the trees, but a crisis that would require him to make choices that would determine the future of tree-human communication throughout the Appalachian region. The trees were warning that the period of relatively stable coexistence that had characterized previous generations was ending, and that the increasing human population and changing social conditions were creating pressures that would force fundamental changes in how tree communication knowledge was protected and transmitted. The warnings that the trees provided about specific threats were becoming more detailed and more alarming, describing human activities that ranged from amateur experimentation, similar to Morrison's efforts, to organized attempts by groups of settlers who believed that tree communication represented valuable commercial knowledge that could be exploited for economic advantage. Some of these groups were reportedly attempting to capture and interrogate members of families who were suspected of possessing tree communication abilities, while others were conducting systematic experiments designed to force trees to reveal information regardless of the consequences for forest ecosystems or human communities. The trees' warnings about these activities came with increasingly urgent requests for the Hannon family to take active measures to prevent the spread of dangerous knowledge and to protect forest secrets from people who would use them irresponsibly. But the trees also acknowledged that such protection would require the Hannon family to accept risks and responsibilities that might ultimately prove unsustainable, and they had begun discussing alternative strategies that might preserve essential knowledge while reducing the burden on human guardians who had already sacrificed so much to maintain the delicate balance between tree consciousness and human survival. As Thomas prepared to inherit the full responsibility for his family's relationship with the trees, he understood that he was accepting not just a privilege and a burden, but a role in a larger story that would determine whether the ancient wisdom that connected human consciousness to forest intelligence could survive the changing world of 19th century America. The trees had warned his family, but they had also chosen them to serve as protectors and advocates in a struggle that would determine the future of both human communities and forest ecosystems throughout the Appalachian Mountains. The secret that the Hannon family had guarded for generations was not simply a collection of techniques for communicating with trees, but a gateway to consciousness that could transform human understanding of their place in natural systems. But this transformation required preparation, wisdom, and moral character that most people lacked. And the trees had learned through painful experience that sharing their secrets with unprepared humans could lead to consequences that were catastrophic for both species. The trees had spoken to the Hannon family and had warned them of dangers that threatened both human communities and forest ecosystems. But they had also silenced everyone else because the knowledge they possessed was too dangerous to share with people who lacked the character and preparation necessary for handling it safely. The story of how the trees chose their human guardians and protected their secrets from those who would abuse them was a testament to the wisdom that could develop through genuine cooperation between different forms of consciousness. But it was also a warning about the price that such cooperation required from those who were chosen to serve as intermediaries between human ambition and natural intelligence that operated according to principles that most people could never fully comprehend or accept.